I used to work as a truck driver in the Pilbara region of Western Australia back in the early 2000s. I was in my mid-30s then, driving road trains to transport iron or from remote mines to ports along the coast. It was grueling work, long hours, dangerous roads, and the kind of isolation that gets under your skin after a while. But the pay was good, and I didn't mind being alone for the most part. The Pilbara is a harsh place, an endless expanse of red dirt, dry shrubs, and searing heat during the day. At night, it's a different beast altogether, quiet, eerie, and full of shadows that play tricks on your mind. I'd heard stories from other drivers about strange things they'd seen out there, but I always chalked it up to fatigue or a bit of exaggeration to pass the time. Until it happened to me. It was a typical night run, sometime in July. The winter months up there aren't as blisteringly hot, but the nights can get cold. I was hauling 3 trailers, fully loaded, on a stretch of road between a remote mine and a coastal port. The road was mostly dirt, and it was rough in places, but I knew it well. I'd driven it so many times I could probably navigate it blindfolded. I'd been on the road for hours, and the fatigue was starting to creep in. The thing about driving long distances at night is that your mind starts playing tricks on you. Every shadow looks like something it's not. A rock on the side of the road becomes a crouching animal. A cluster of shrubs turns into a person standing just out of the headlight's reach. You know it's not real, but it still makes your heart skip a beat every time. That night, the shadows seemed worse than usual. I'd seen the black dog before, a term we drivers used for hallucinations caused by exhaustion. But this was different. I swear I saw 3 goats standing in the middle of the road at one point. But as I got closer, they seemed to morph into something larger, something that didn't make sense. By the time I reached the spot, there was nothing there. Just empty road and the sound of my engine echoing into the night. Then there was the corgi. Akodham corgi. If you know anything about the Pilbara, you'll know how ridiculous that sounds. It's not exactly a place where you'd find domesticated dogs wandering around, let alone a breed like that. But there it was, darting across the road, right in front of my truck. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the dirt, and when I came to a stop, there was nothing. No dog, no tracks, no sign that anything had been there at all. I told myself it was just my tired brain messing with me. I'd been driving for too long without a proper break, and I needed to rest. So a few hours later, I pulled off the road at a small clearing I'd used before. It was far enough from the road to be safe, and the ground was flat enough for the truck. I let the engine run cold for about 10 minutes, then climbed into the sleeper cab at the back. It was quiet out there. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you aware of every little sound. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the shadows, the goats, the corgi. I told myself it was nothing, just fatigue. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a strange noise. It wasn't a voice, but it had a rhythm to it, like some kind of pattern. It was faint at first, but it got louder, closer. Then the truck started shaking. Not just a little tremor, but a full-on rocking motion like something, or someone was outside, trying to tip it over. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I reached for the door latch, but stopped myself. What if there was something out there? What if it wasn't just goats or the wind? I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window, but the beam only reached so far. Shadows danced on the edge of the light, but I couldn't make out anything clear. Then I looked in the side mirror, and my stomach dropped. There were shapes moving around the truck. Not people, not animals, just shapes. They were dark and low to the ground, circling like predators. My hands were shaking as I reached for the ignition. The truck roared to life, and I flicked on every single light I had, headlights, floodlights, everything. The clearing lit up like a stadium, and whatever was out there scattered. I didn't get a good look at them, just fleeting glimpses of movement as they disappeared into the darkness. I didn't waste any time. I threw the truck into gear and got back on the road, my heart racing and my eyes glued to the mirrors. I kept expecting something to follow me, but nothing did. The rest of the drive to the port was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. When I finally reached the port and parked the truck, I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe some goats wandering around, and my exhausted brain filling in the gaps. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I never slept on a night shift again after that. If I got tired, I'd pull over at a roadhouse or wait until dawn to rest. Whatever happened out there that night, I wasn't going to risk it again. To this day, I can't explain it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there's something out in the Pilbara that we don't understand. Either way, it's a night I'll never forget. I used to run hotshot freight across the Great Plains, covering places like North Dakota and Montana. This was back in 2012 when I was in my early 40s, and I'd been on the road for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I liked the solitude. There's something calming about being out on the open road with nothing but your truck and the sound of the tires humming on the pavement. That night, I was hauling a critical tractor part, a hydraulic assembly for a combine harvester. A farm in Montana desperately needed it for the next morning. Without it, their whole operation would have come to a standstill during harvest, and time is money in farming. I'd picked up the load in Fargo and was pushing hard to make it to Great Falls by sunrise. It was about 2 a.m., and I was somewhere in the middle of North Dakota, a place so flat you can see the horizon stretch endlessly in every direction. If you've never driven through North Dakota at night, let me paint a picture for you. Miles of straight, featureless highway, flanked by fields and open prairie. The occasional wind turbine or grain silo breaks up the monotony, but for the most part, it's just black sky and endless road. The kind of landscape that makes you feel small, like you're the only person left in the world. I'd been driving for hours, and highway hypnosis was starting to creep in. It's a strange feeling, almost like your mind detaches from your body. You're still alert, still driving, but everything starts to blur together. The white lines on the road, the hum of the engine, it all becomes this rhythmic loop that pulls at your focus. I'd been through it hundreds of times before, so I wasn't too worried. I just shook my head, cranked up the radio, and took a swig of lukewarm coffee from my thermos. The caffeine wasn't doing much at that point, but it was better than nothing. The road was dead quiet. No cars coming or going, just me and the occasional set of distant headlights way off in the opposite direction. That's when I noticed something on the road ahead of me. At first, it was just a dark shape stretched across my lane. I figured it was a chunk of retread, rubber from a blown semi-tire. It happens all the time, and I was already preparing to move into the left lane to avoid it. But as I got closer, something about it didn't look right. It wasn't just a lump. It was long, like a line stretched across the lane. I eased off the gas and squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My headlights finally caught it, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a chunk of rubber. It was 2 people, lying head to toe across the lane, perfectly still. My heart started racing. My first thought was that they'd been hit by a car and left there. But as I slowed down even more, something didn't sit right. Their clothes looked clean, not torn or bloodied. And they weren't sprawled out like you'd expect in an accident. They were too deliberate. Positioned. I swerved into the opposite lane at the last second, my trailer rattling as the wheels crossed the rumble strips. I managed to avoid them and came to an almost complete stop a little further down the road. My hands were gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to back up and check on them. What if they were hurt? What if they needed help? But as I reached for the gear shift, a memory popped into my head. An old-timer I used to run with, Bill, a graybeard who'd been driving longer than I'd been alive, had once told me a story. He said there were places out in the sticks where people would lie down in the road to get a driver to stop. Then, while the driver was distracted, others would rush out from the bushes or the ditch, rob him blind, maybe worse. At the time, I'd brushed it off as one of those tall tales truckers like to tell. But now, sitting there on that dark, empty highway, I wasn't so sure. I glanced in my side mirror. They still hadn't moved. Not an inch. That was the part that really got to me. If they were alive, why weren't they reacting to a 20-ton truck barreling past them? Why weren't they getting up, waving for help, doing something? I flipped the truck back into gear and slowly started moving forward. As soon as my taillights started to fade, I saw them in the rearview mirror. Both of them stood up and walked toward the shoulder of the road. They didn't run, didn't try to chase me, just calmly walked away, disappearing into the darkness. My hands were trembling as I picked up my phone and dialed 911. I gave the dispatcher my location and told her what I'd seen. She asked if I could stay in the area until a patrol car arrived, but I said no. I wasn't about to sit there and wait, not with whatever that was still out there. I apologized and told her I'd keep driving, but I'd leave my hazard lights on for the next few miles in case anyone else came through. The rest of the drive was tense. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like someone lurking, waiting. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights closing in behind me. But nothing happened. Just miles of empty road and the occasional gust of wind rattling the cab. When I finally reached the truck stop in Glendive, Montana, I pulled into the lot and parked as close to the building as I could. My nerves were shot. I sat there for a while, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if I'd made the right call. What if they really had needed help? What if I'd just left two stranded travelers in the middle of nowhere? But then I'd think about the way they stood up, the way they calmly walked away as soon as I started to leave. It didn't make sense. None of it did. I never heard back from the police, and I don't know if they ever found those two people. Maybe they were hitchhikers playing a dangerous game. Maybe it was some kind of setup, like Bill had warned me about. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that old Graybeard saved me that night. If it weren't for his story, I might have stopped. I might have gotten out of the truck to check on them. And who knows what would have happened then. That night changed the way I look at the road. I'm still out here, still driving, but I'm more cautious now. More aware. There's a lot of good people out there, but there's also a lot of bad ones. And sometimes, it's hard to tell the difference until it's too late. It was back in the fall of 2006 when I was working flatbed, hauling loads of construction materials all across the southeast. That particular day, I had a shipment of prepackaged boxes, drywall, roofing materials, or something similar, that I had to pick up from a rural yard in northern Mississippi. It was one of those spots tucked away between the state lines of Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi, out in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where the air smells like pine and the nearest gas station might as well be an hour away. The load required tarping, which wasn't unusual for flatbed work. So, I spent a good chunk of time strapping everything down and throwing the tarps over the load before securing it with bungee cords. I remember it was one of those jobs where everything just feels a little off, like the straps don't want to tighten evenly, and the tarp doesn't quite sit right no matter how much you adjust it. By the time I finished, I was already feeling frustrated. Still, the load was secure, and I figured it'd hold just fine for the 300-mile run ahead. About 5 miles down the road, though, I noticed the tarp flapping in the wind through my side mirror. I cursed under my breath. I hated when this happened. It usually meant I'd either done a rush job or missed securing a corner. Either way, it had to be fixed before it turned into a problem. I found a wide shoulder on the side of the road and pulled over. The area was surrounded by nothing but trees on both sides, just dense woods stretching for miles. It was late afternoon, and the light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the road. After parking, I climbed out and walked to the back of the trailer to inspect the tarp. Sure enough, I'd botched the job. One corner hadn't been properly secured, and the whole thing was starting to come loose. I decided to redo the whole setup rather than risk having it unravel further down the road. So I unhooked all the bungee cords, dragged the tarps off the load, and rolled them up again. By this point, I was annoyed with myself, but focused on getting the job done. I was standing on top of the load, unrolling the tarp to start over, when I noticed someone walking down the road. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, coming from the same direction I'd just driven in. It wasn't unusual to see people walking along rural roads, but something about this guy made me uneasy. He was moving at a steady pace, heading right toward my truck. I kept an eye on him as I worked. He was still a ways off, so I figured I'd finish securing the tarp before he got too close. But as he got nearer, I started noticing details that put me on edge. His hair was the first thing that caught my attention, a patchy, uneven mullet that looked like it had been hacked at with a pair of dull scissors. Then there were his clothes, dirty and ill-fitting, with a pair of white sneakers so worn out they didn't even have laces. One of the tongues was sticking out at an odd angle, flopping with every step. When he was about 50 yards away, I climbed down from the trailer and grabbed my winch bar. It wasn't that I felt immediately threatened, but I wasn't about to take any chances either. An 8-pound solid metal bar was better than nothing if things went south. The guy finally reached me and stopped a few feet away. The first thing I noticed up close was his eyes. They were clear, but there was something off about them, like he was there physically, but his mind was somewhere else. He looked at me and said, "I've got a long walk. His voice was flat, almost emotionless. I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. Yeah, looks like it. I made it clear with my body language that I wasn't offering a ride. He just nodded back, then walked past me toward the cab of my truck. I turned to keep an eye on him, and as he reached the driver's door, he stopped and looked back at me. I've got a long walk, he said again, his voice exactly the same as before. This time, I explained that I couldn't give him a ride. Something about him just didn't sit right with me, and I wasn't about to break company policy for a guy who gave me the creeps. He seemed to accept it and kept walking down the road, disappearing into the growing shadows. I waited until he was a good distance away before climbing back onto the trailer to finish securing the tarp. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still around. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the road and the woods for any sign of him. By the time I hooked the last bungee cord, I felt a little more at ease. I climbed into the cab, set the winch bar on the passenger seat, and locked the doors. As I was about to start the engine, I glanced in the side mirror and saw him again. He was about 100 yards ahead of the truck, walking back toward me. This time, he had one hand up to his face, like he was holding a phone, and his other hand was gesturing wildly, as if he was having an argument. But as he got closer, I realized there was no phone. He was talking to his hand. My gut tightened. Something wasn't right about this guy. He looked angry now, his face contorted as he mumbled and waved his hand around. I didn't wait to see what he was going to do. I started the truck, shifted into gear, and pulled back onto the road without even checking for traffic. As I passed him, he stopped walking and turned to look at me. His expression was blank, but his eyes stayed locked on mine as I drove past. By the time I hit fifth gear, I checked my mirror again. The road behind me was empty. He was gone. I don't know where he went or what his deal was, but I didn't stop again until I reached a well-lit truck stop miles away. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. Maybe he was just some harmless drifter, but something about him felt wrong, like a warning I couldn't ignore. I've seen plenty of strange things on the road, but that guy, he still gives me the creeps. It was late summer 2012 when I was running a dedicated freight route through eastern Washington. I'd driven that stretch of state road hundreds of times. The area was remote, no towns for miles, just rolling plains and farmland stretching as far as the eye could see. The road was long and straight, bordered by patches of dry grass and the occasional grove of trees, with few places to stop. But I always planned my trips carefully, knowing there were massive dirt pull-offs about every 40 miles. They weren't official rest stops, just big, flat spaces where you could safely park away from the road for a few hours of shut-eye. That night, I'd been pushing myself to stay ahead of schedule. I was hauling a shipment of machinery parts to a distribution center in Spokane. I figured I could catch a few hours of sleep before continuing the last leg of the trip in the early morning. Around 10 p.m., I found one of those familiar dirt pull-offs and parked my rig. It was one of the larger spots, big enough for 2 trucks, but I was the only one there. The night was quiet, except for the faint rustle of the wind blowing across the flatlands. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the ground. I shut off the engine, closed my blinds, and climbed into the sleeper. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to a couple of hours of rest. After grabbing a snack, I laid down and started watching something on my phone to wind down. I didn't hear another vehicle pass the entire time, which wasn't unusual for that stretch of road late at night. About an hour later, just as I was beginning to feel drowsy, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the driver's side door. My heart shot into my throat. The sound was subtle at first, a faint metallic click as if the handle was being tested. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I'd locked it wrong, or perhaps the wind was messing with something. But the sound was deliberate. Someone was outside. I sat up, my breathing shallow, and peeked out through a gap in the curtain. The night was pitch black beyond the faint glow of my parking lights. I couldn't see anything on the driver's side. Before I had time to process, I heard the same noise on the passenger side. This time more forceful, as if whoever it was tugging at the handle. I froze, straining my ears for any other sounds. The wind outside seemed louder now, whistling against the truck, but there was no mistaking the distinct metallic click of the handles being pulled. I leaned toward the passenger side, peeking through the top of the curtain. Still, there was nothing. No shadowy figure, no other vehicle, nothing but open ground and a few scattered trees. My instincts kicked in. I reached down and started the truck, the engine roaring to life and flooding the area with light as the headlights and side markers came on. My hands trembled as I checked the mirrors. No one. Nothing. The dirt pull-off was completely empty. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe the wind had rattled something, I thought. Maybe I was just jumpy from being alone in the middle of nowhere. Still, I wasn't about to let my guard down. I decided to close the curtains to the sleeper, as if that thin barrier would somehow make me feel safer. It didn't. I laid back down, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then I heard it again, this time louder. The unmistakable sound of fingers tapping on the glass. First on the driver's side, then the passenger's. My skin crawled. It wasn't the wind. It couldn't be. Someone, or something, was outside. The tapping grew more insistent, moving from the windows to the vents on the sleeper. Then the truck shifted slightly, the chassis groaning, as if someone was climbing on it. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for the small alarm button in the sleeper, slamming it with my palm. The loud, piercing sound filled the cab, but the noises outside didn't stop. The door handles rattled again, the tapping on the glass becoming almost frantic. The truck shifted once more, the suspension hissing as it adjusted to the weight. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat there, frozen, listening to my own ragged breathing and the faint hum of the engine. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then I saw headlights in the distance, growing brighter as another truck approached on the road. I held my breath as it passed, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. The noise didn't return. Whoever, or whatever, it seemed to be gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, my eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of the truck to inspect it. The dirt around the rig was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But when I walked around to the windows, my stomach dropped. There were handprints, tiny, human-looking handprints, smeared across every window of the cab. They were faint, like someone with sticky or wet hands had pressed against the glass over and over. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. They were too small to belong to an adult. A child, maybe? But that didn't make sense either. Who would bring a child out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? I wiped the windows clean, climbed back into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I reached Spokane. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. I've told myself it was just some drifter messing with me, but deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. There was no sign of another vehicle, no footprints, no logical explanation for the handprints. To this day, every time I park in a remote spot, I think about that night. I lock my doors, double-check my mirrors, and keep my winch bar within arm's reach. Because whatever happened out there on that lonely stretch of road, I know one thing for sure. I never want to experience it again. I used to drive a truck in northern Manitoba back in the mid-2000s, hauling freight to some of the most remote communities in Canada. If you've ever been up there, you know how vast and untouched the wilderness is. Endless forests, icy lakes, and miles upon miles of lonely roads that feel like they stretch into nowhere. Some of these routes are so isolated, you can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle. It's just you, your truck, and the bush. One of these roads was in the northeast, a long, flat stretch of Tulane blacktop, cutting through some of the densest forest I've ever seen. The trees were so thick in some areas that even in the middle of the day, it felt like dusk. I remember always being hyper-aware of wildlife out there, moose, elk, deer, even the occasional bear. A collision with any of them could be catastrophic. It was early fall, late September, when this happened. I was driving a load of building supplies to a small community near the Hudson Bay. The mornings were crisp and cool, with a thin layer of frost on the grass, but the afternoons still had that lingering warmth from summer. It was late afternoon when I hit the long, straight stretch of road. I'd been driving for about 4 hours and hadn't seen a single other vehicle. The road was empty, the bush on either side as still as could be. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the steady hum of my engine and the occasional clatter of my trailer hitting a bump. I wasn't tired, but I was in that familiar zone truckers get into when you've been on the road for a while, alert but almost on autopilot, scanning the road ahead for anything out of the ordinary. I was maybe 10 minutes into this straight stretch when I saw something. At first, it was just a movement in the distance, way down the road, too far to make out any details. I figured it was an animal crossing, nothing unusual up here. But as I got closer, I realized whatever it was didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It was big, not long, like a moose or elk, but tall, taller than the hood of my truck. It moved quickly, but there was something strange about the way it walked, almost like it was gliding, not bounding or trotting like most animals would. I couldn't make out a shape. It was just a large, dark figure. It crossed the road in a matter of seconds, disappearing into the thick brush on the other side. By the time I reached the spot where it had crossed, it was gone. The bush on either side of the road was dense, the kind of forest that's nearly impossible to navigate without a machete. I slowed down as I passed, glancing into the trees, but all I could see were shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. It was the kind of unease that's hard to explain, like your body knows something is wrong before your mind can catch up. I kept driving, trying to shake it off, but the image of that tall figure stuck with me. That night, after delivering my load, I parked at a truck stop and tuned into the radio to pass the time. A local tow truck driver came on one of the channels, talking about something he'd seen on the same stretch of road. He sounded shaken, his voice tense, and he kept repeating that he wasn't crazy. He described seeing a tall, dark figure step onto the road in front of him, only to disappear into the trees before he could get a good look. He went on to say that he was convinced it was Bigfoot. He even described its gait, the way it moved, smooth and deliberate, almost human but not quite. I listened in silence, my heart racing as I realized how closely his description matched what I had seen earlier that day. I didn't say anything on the radio. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who jumps in with me too, and gets laughed at. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd spent years driving those roads, and I'd seen plenty of wildlife. I knew what a moose looked like, or a bear, or even a big elk. This wasn't any of those. A few days later, I was making another run to the same area, and stopped at a small store in one of the indigenous communities along the way. I got to talking with one of the locals, a man in his 50s who'd lived in the area his whole life. I mentioned the tow truck driver's story, carefully leaving out my own experience, and asked if he'd ever heard of anything like that. He nodded, almost casually, and said the elders in the community often spoke about such creatures. To them, it wasn't a big deal, just another animal that lived in the bush. He didn't call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, just said they were part of the land, like the moose or the bears. His calm, matter-of-fact tone unnerved me more than anything else. I didn't know what to think. I still don't. Whatever I saw that day wasn't a bear, or a moose, or a deer. It was something else. Something I can't explain. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road whenever I can. It's not that I'm scared. I've spent too many nights alone in the middle of nowhere to be easily spooked, but there's something about that place that doesn't feel right. Every time I drive through that area, I catch myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that dark figure again. I don't know what I saw that day, and maybe I never will. But one thing's for sure. There are things out there in the wilderness that we don't understand. Things that don't fit neatly into our little boxes of logic and reason. And sometimes it's better to leave them alone. I've been driving trucks for a good part of my life, and Kansas is no stranger to me. I live out in the central part of the state, but I've driven that long western stretch of I-70 more times than I can count. If you've been out there, you know what it's like, flat, endless, and lonely. The towns you pass feel like forgotten remnants of another era, with boarded-up gas stations, faded signs, and barely a soul around. It's the kind of place where your thoughts start to echo inside your head after a while. I've always had a weird respect for that stretch of road. It feels timeless, like it hasn't changed in decades, and there's something unsettling about how empty it gets, especially at night. I usually try to avoid driving it in the dark because the isolation can really mess with your head. But every now and then, work demands it. This particular night, I was hauling a load of equipment to a small warehouse just outside of Denver. It was late summer, and the days were still hot, but the nights had that hint of coolness that signaled fall was around the corner. I'd started the drive later than I wanted, around 9 p.m., which meant most of my trip would be under the stars. By the time I hit the western edge of Kansas, it was past midnight. The sky was a dark blanket of stars, and the highway was dead. No other cars, no lights, just my truck rumbling along in the darkness. I had the radio on low, more for company than anything else, but even that felt hollow in the emptiness. About an hour into this stretch, I saw headlights in my mirrors. At first, they were just a distant glow, but they slowly got closer until a car was trailing me. I figured they'd just pass me. It's common enough on these roads, especially with how slow trucks can be. But they didn't. They hung behind me, their headlights reflecting in my mirrors, just far enough back that I couldn't make out the vehicle clearly. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were being cautious or weren't in a hurry. But after 10 minutes of them staying in the same spot, I started to get that prickling feeling of unease. It wasn't like they were matching my speed perfectly, but they weren't making any move to pass either. Finally, the car pulled out into the left lane and started to overtake me. I glanced over as they passed. It was an older sedan, something like a mid-90s Buick or Oldsmobile, with dull paint and cloudy headlights. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I caught a glimpse of their silhouette. It was just a shadowy figure behind the wheel, sitting stiff and upright. Once they got ahead of me, they slowed down. Not drastically, but enough that I had to tap my brakes to avoid getting too close. I muttered a curse under my breath. I've seen this kind of thing before, drivers who don't know how to maintain their speed, or maybe they're just distracted. But as I moved to pass them, they sped up again, staying just ahead of me. This little game went on for a while. They'd slow down, forcing me to change lanes and try to pass, then they'd speed up, staying just out of reach. After the third or fourth time, I was getting irritated. It's not like I could just gun it and leave them behind. I was hauling 40,000 pounds of freight, and trucks don't exactly move like sports cars. About 20 miles later, the sedan suddenly pulled off onto the shoulder. I breathed a sigh of relief and kept going, thinking they were finally out of my hair. But 10 minutes later, I saw those same headlights in my mirrors again. My stomach sank. This time, they didn't tail me. They sped up and passed me on the left, then swerved back into my lane, just a little too close for comfort. I had to hit the brakes to avoid them. They stayed in front of me for a minute, then slowed down again, forcing me to change lanes to go around them. And of course, as soon as I got beside them, they sped up again. By now, my hands were gripping the wheel tightly, and my heart was pounding. This wasn't just someone being careless or distracted. They were messing with me. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I'd dealt with my fair share of weirdos on the road. But this was different. It was late, I was alone, and we were miles from anywhere. The next time I passed a sign for a rest area, I decided to pull off. I figured if I got off the road, maybe they'd lose interest and keep going. But as I signaled and moved onto the exit ramp, they followed me. The rest area was empty, just a small lot with a couple of picnic tables and a lone streetlight casting a weak glow. I pulled into a spot and killed the engine, watching the car as it slowed down and rolled into the lot behind me. They didn't park. Instead, they idled at the entrance, their headlights washing over my truck. I sat there, staring at those lights, my pulse racing. After what felt like an eternity, the car backed up, turned around, and headed back onto the highway. I waited a few minutes, watching to make sure they didn't come back. When the coast seemed clear, I started my truck and got back on the road. I kept my eyes on my mirrors, scanning for any sign of those headlights, but they were gone. I thought that was the end of it. But about 30 minutes later, as I neared the Colorado state line, I saw them again. This time, they were parked on the shoulder, their lights off, just sitting there like they were waiting for me. As I passed, their headlights flicked on, and they pulled out onto the road behind me. My heart was in my throat. I didn't know what they wanted, but I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my truck as fast as it would go. The car kept up for a while, but eventually, their headlights started to fade in my mirrors. When I finally reached the toll plaza near the border, I pulled into the lane and stopped, rolling down my window to talk to the worker. She asked for my payment, but I quickly explained what had been happening. She frowned, glanced at the car pulling up behind me, and nodded. "Stay here," she said. "I'll handle it." She waved me through, but told me to pull over on the other side and wait. I did as she said, parking just beyond the toll plaza. In my mirrors, I saw her talking to the driver of the car, her body language sharp and firm. After a few minutes, the car backed up, switched lanes, and drove off down the highway. When she came back to my truck, she told me to sit tight for a few minutes before heading out. I took her advice, waiting until I was sure the car was gone before getting back on the road. That night, I got off the highway at the first exit I could and took back roads all the way home. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about that car. I don't know what their deal was. Maybe it was just some idiot trying to scare me, or maybe it was something more sinister. Either way, it was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Driving at night has never felt the same since. It was a long day of deliveries, and I was finally heading home. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving the sky painted in deep blues and blacks. I was driving through what could generously be called the outskirts of town. Empty lots, patches of dirt and sand, scattered brush, and the occasional rundown trailer. There wasn't much out here, and what little there was had an air of abandonment. This stretch of road always gave me an uneasy feeling. The streetlights were few and far between, and the shadows seemed to swallow everything outside the reach of my headlights. Still, it was the fastest way home, and after a 12-hour shift, I wasn't about to take the scenic route. I was halfway through the stretch, my mind wandering between the day's work and what leftovers might still be in my fridge, when something darted out from the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote, but as it moved into the beam of my headlights, I realized it was a person, a woman to be exact. She was running straight into the middle of the road, waving her arms frantically and yelling something I couldn't make out. She wasn't wearing much, just a t-shirt and underwear, and her hair was wild, flying around her face as she moved. She looked scared. My first instinct was to slow down, and my foot hovered over the brake pedal for a moment. But then the part of my brain that had been honed by years of living in a not-so-great town kicked in. I'd seen this kind of thing before. Women, or sometimes even kids, would flag down a car, acting like they were in trouble, and when the driver stopped to help, a group of men would rush out from the bushes or shadows. They'd rob you, beat you, maybe even take your car. It was a common enough tactic in this area, and I wasn't about to fall for it. Not tonight. Not ever. So I kept driving. I veered slightly to the left to give her a wide berth and kept my speed steady. As I passed her, she yelled louder, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of her face. She looked young, early 20s, maybe even younger, and her expression was a mix of desperation and fear. For a moment, guilt gnawed at me. What if she really was in trouble? What if she wasn't part of some setup? But then I reminded myself that I couldn't take the risk. It was too dangerous. People could be unpredictable, especially out here. About a mile down the road, though, the guilt began to weigh heavier. Something about her didn't sit right with me. She hadn't looked homeless. She didn't have that worn, hardened look that people on the streets usually have. Her clothes, though minimal, weren't tattered or dirty. And that look on her face, that wasn't the look of someone trying to lure in a mark. That was the look of someone who was genuinely terrified. I wrestled with my thoughts for a few minutes, my hands tightening on the steering wheel as I debated what to do. Finally, I sighed and made the decision to turn around. The ethical thing to do was to go back. Shitty people in the world shouldn't make the rest of us shitty too, right? I found a spot to pull a quick U-turn and started heading back the way I came, scanning the sides of the road for any sign of her. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes since I'd passed her, but as I drove back through the area where I'd seen her, she was gone. I slowed down, my eyes darting back and forth, trying to catch any movement in the dim light. The road was empty. The dirt shoulders were empty. Just the same sand, rocks, and scrubby brush stretching out into the darkness. There was no sign of her. I kept driving a little farther, thinking maybe she'd run down the road or into the brush, but there was nothing. The only other vehicle I passed was an older blue Toyota, a late 90s model, if I had to guess, that was parked off the shoulder a few hundred yards back. The headlights were off, and the car just sat there, dark and silent. I thought about stopping, but something about that car made my stomach twist. It didn't feel right. Instead, I kept going, heading back in the direction of home. By the time I got back to my original route, I was kicking myself for turning around. She was probably just a carjacker, or maybe she'd hitched a ride with someone else. Either way, there wasn't anything I could do now. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. That blue Toyota stuck in my mind. Why had it been parked there, so close to where she'd been running? And if she'd been running from someone, could it have been the driver of that car? The thought made my chest tighten. I tried to push it out of my mind, but later that night, as I was lying in bed, it all came rushing back. I replayed the scene over and over in my head. The way she'd waved her arms, the panic in her eyes, the stillness of that blue car. What if she had been running from something or someone? What if the person in that car had been chasing her? I'll never know for sure what happened that night. Maybe she was just a carjacker. Maybe she was in real danger. Or maybe it was something in between. All I know is that I still think about her sometimes, and every time I do, I hope, deep down, that she really was just trying to pull a scam. Because the alternative is too unsettling to dwell on. When you're out there on those empty roads, you start to realize just how small and vulnerable you really are. And sometimes, it's not the darkness or the isolation that gets to you. It's the things you see, or don't see, that stick with you. Things that make you wonder what could have happened if you'd made a different choice. Things that keep you up at night. That's the thing about driving those lonely stretches of road. You never know what you're going to encounter. And sometimes you don't want to know. It was just after midnight when I found myself driving down an empty stretch of highway in rural Oklahoma. I had a long haul ahead, moving auto parts from Texas to Missouri. The road was a lonely two-lane strip cutting through endless farmland. No streetlights, no traffic, just the hum of my engine and the soft whine of the tires against the pavement. I liked driving at night, usually. The roads were clear, no rush-hour traffic, no impatient drivers weaving in and out of lanes. Just me, my truck, and the open road. But tonight, something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, too quiet even for the countryside. Or maybe it was the sky, unusually dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. I took a sip of my coffee, the bitter taste keeping me awake. The only light came from my headlights, stretching ahead, illuminating the worn asphalt and the fields beyond. Here and there, I passed an old farmhouse, its windows dark and lifeless, like no one had lived there for years. Then, up ahead, I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, just at the edge of my headlight's reach. At first, I thought he was a hitchhiker, maybe someone whose car had broken down. But as I got closer, I realized something was strange about him. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't even looking at me. He just stood there, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly downward, like he was staring at his feet. His clothes were dirty, almost gray, blending into the darkness around him. His arms hung loosely at his sides. He didn't move, didn't shift, didn't react to my approaching truck. I passed him slowly, my eyes locked on him as long as possible. I half expected him to suddenly lift his head, to reveal some twisted face, some unnatural expression. But he didn't. He remained motionless. As soon as I passed, I checked my side mirror. He was gone. Not walking away. Not turning around. Just gone. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe the darkness played tricks on my eyes. Maybe he had stepped back into the shadows. I shook off the unease and kept driving. A few miles later, I saw another one. Same stance, same posture, same downward tilted head. He stood at the exact same distance from the road, just standing there like he was waiting for something. My grip tightened on the wheel. I passed him, forcing myself to look straight ahead, but at the last second, I glanced in the mirror. Gone. I exhaled, my breath shaky. Two identical figures in the same position, only miles apart? That wasn't normal. That wasn't something I could explain away as my imagination. My mind raced. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe a group of people trying to mess with drivers? But who would stand out on a deserted highway in the middle of nowhere at this hour, dressed in filthy clothes, just standing? My gut told me something was wrong, but I had a job to do. I kept driving. 15 minutes later, another one. This time, I was ready. I slowed slightly, staring hard as I approached. His clothes were tattered, like they'd been worn for weeks without washing. His shoes were caked in dirt. I watched him, waiting for him to move, waiting for some sign that he was real. But he did nothing, just stood there, staring at his feet. I passed, checked the mirror. Gone. I felt a cold sweat on my back, a deep, creeping dread settling into my bones. I reached for my CB radio, needing to hear another voice, needing someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Breaker 19, anyone out here? My voice came out shakier than I'd intended. Static. I cleared my throat. Anyone else seeing some weird folks on the road? Silence. Then a crackle. A voice. Driver, you seeing them? My stomach twisted. Someone else had seen them. I grabbed the mic, yeah. 3 so far. Same stance, same look. What the hell is this? A pause. Then the other driver spoke again. Don't know. I've seen 5. I gripped the wheel tighter. 5. Yeah. Last one was just a minute ago. Same as yours, standing still, head down. Didn't look up, didn't move. I swallowed hard. You look back. Another pause. Then quieter. Yeah. My breath caught. They weren't there, the driver continued. Just gone. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. I don't like this, man, the other driver admitted. Neither do I. We rode in silence for a while, both of us just driving, both of us knowing we weren't alone on this road. Then he spoke again. You think we should pull over? Try to figure this out. I shook my head. No. Keep driving. Don't stop. Yeah, he agreed quickly. Yeah, you're right. I stayed on the line with him, neither of us willing to disconnect. We were just voices in the night, two strangers sharing the same eerie experience. Then, up ahead, I saw another one. This time, closer to the road, maybe only a few feet from the white line. I felt my hands go cold. Another one, I murmured into the CB. Me too, the other driver said. I swallowed, my throat dry. This one's closer. Mine too. The truck felt smaller, the cab pressing in around me. My heart pounded. I forced myself to keep my speed steady. Forced myself not to stare too long. As I passed, I didn't check the mirror. I didn't want to see if he had disappeared. The other driver was breathing heavy over the CB. I don't like this, man. Feels wrong. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, we kept going. No more figures appeared. We rode in silence for another hour, waiting, listening, but nothing else happened. Finally, the other driver exhaled. Think we're past it. I glanced at the clock. Almost 4 a.m. Maybe. He let out a nervous chuckle. Man, I'm gonna need a strong cup of coffee after this. I smiled, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. Yeah, the rest of the trip was uneventful. But I never forgot that night. I still wonder, who were they? Why were they there? And what would have happened if I had stopped? I've been a trucker for over 12 years. I've seen my fair share of weird things on the road. Strange people, accidents, unexplained lights in the sky. But nothing ever shook me like the night I found someone in my sleeper cab. It happened about 5 years ago, somewhere in Oklahoma. I had been on the road all day, hauling a load of produce from Texas to Missouri. By the time I pulled into a small rest area, it was close to midnight. I was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that makes your whole body ache. There were only a few other trucks parked at the rest stop. The place was nearly silent except for the occasional rumble of an engine or the distant hum of insects in the night. I found an empty spot at the far end, away from the streetlights, and shut off the engine. I locked my doors, checked my mirrors, and climbed into the sleeper to get some rest. I had no idea I wasn't alone. I stretched out on my bunk, staring up at the ceiling. The inside of the cab was dim, with just a little light coming through the curtains from the parking lot outside. Something felt off. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was exhausted, maybe even a little dehydrated, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned over, trying to get comfortable, but that uneasy sensation wouldn't go away. It was like I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia. I had been driving too long, and my mind was messing with me, but I couldn't sleep. After about 10 minutes of tossing and turning, I sat up with a sigh. I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the weird feeling. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound. I froze. It was coming from inside the cab. My blood turned ice cold. The sound wasn't loud, just a soft shifting noise, like fabric moving against fabric. But I knew, without a doubt, that I was the only one supposed to be in that truck. I held my breath, listening. My eyes darted around the small space. The sleeper wasn't big, just a bunk, a few storage compartments, and a curtain separating it from the driver's seat. There was nowhere for someone to hide. Or so I thought. Slowly, I reached toward the small flashlight I kept next to my bed. My fingers closed around it, and I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. And then I saw him. He was lying in the far corner of the sleeper, half hidden by a pile of blankets. A man, a stranger, curled up, knees to his chest, face buried in his arms. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. How the hell had he gotten in? My doors were locked. My truck had been sealed up tight since I stopped. And yet, he was there. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted. No response. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. I couldn't even tell if he was breathing. I grabbed the handle of the sleeper door, ready to bolt out of there, but a new thought hit me. What if he was dead? What if I had been sleeping next to a corpse? I swallowed hard. My flashlight shook in my hand. I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I inched forward, keeping the light trained on him. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse. "You okay?" "Nothing." My pulse pounded in my ears. I took another small step. Then he moved. Not like someone waking up. Not like someone stretching or shifting in their sleep. It was sudden. Sharp. His head snapped up, and I saw his face for the first time. And my heart nearly stopped. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were wide open, too wide, bloodshot and unblinking. And he was grinning. Not a normal smile. Not something a person should make in the middle of the night. His lips stretched too far, like his face couldn't quite contain it. His teeth were yellowed, crooked, and he was staring right at me. I stumbled backward, hitting the side of the sleeper. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Then he started laughing. A low, wheezing chuckle that sent a wave of pure terror down my spine. I didn't wait to hear another sound. I lunged for the door, yanking it open with shaking hands. Cold night air rushed in as I practically threw myself out of the truck, landing hard on the pavement. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, my heart slamming against my ribs. I expected to hear footsteps behind me, expected to see him crawling out of the cab. But nothing happened. The truck was silent. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood there, chest heaving, my legs weak. My brain tried to make sense of what just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I dreaming? No. I knew what I saw, and I sure as hell knew I hadn't imagined that laughter. I forced myself to move. I had to check. Had to be sure. Slowly, I stepped forward, my hands clenched into fists. I reached the door and peered inside. Empty. The blankets were still piled in the corner, but the man was gone. There was no way. I had been watching the truck the whole time. There was no way he could have slipped past me. And yet, he was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I locked my doors, double-checked them, and sat in the driver's seat with my knife in my lap. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I didn't dare close my eyes. As soon as the sun was up, I pulled out of that rest stop and never looked back. To this day, I have no idea how that man got into my truck. I don't know where he went, and I don't know what the hell was wrong with him. All I know is that I never park at that rest stop again. I had been driving for almost 10 hours straight, hauling a load of steel pipes from Nebraska to Arkansas. It was just after 2 a.m., and I was dead tired. The highway was empty, stretching ahead like a long, dark ribbon cutting through the countryside. The only light came from my headlights, carving out a small path in the darkness. I had driven through plenty of nights before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the silence, too quiet, even for a rural highway. No cars, no signs of life. Just my truck, the road, and the endless fields on either side. I took a sip of my coffee, hoping the caffeine would keep me alert. It was lukewarm and bitter, but it was better than nothing. My eyelids felt heavy, and I knew I needed to find a place to rest soon. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a pile of clothes. A dark shape lying at the edge of the road, half hidden in the grass. But as my truck got closer, I realized it was a man. He was lying face down in the ditch, arms stretched out, body completely still. I felt a jolt of unease. It wasn't unusual to see roadkill, even the occasional deer carcass. But a person? Out here, in the middle of nowhere? That wasn't normal. I slowed the truck slightly, my hands tightening on the wheel. For a second, I debated stopping. What if he was hurt? What if he needed help? But something in my gut told me to keep driving. I passed him, my eyes flicking to the side mirror. And that's when I saw it. The man moved. Not like someone waking up. Not like someone shifting in their sleep. It was a sudden, jerky movement. His head lifted, just slightly. And then, as my truck rumbled past, his body twisted unnaturally, as if he was trying to turn toward me. I didn't stop to get a better look. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving. For the next few miles, my heart pounded in my chest. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, staring after me. But there was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. I was exhausted after all. My mind could have been playing games with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That movement had been real. I turned on my CB radio, hoping for some company. Breaker 19, anyone out there? Static. I cleared my throat and tried again. Anybody running Highway 54 tonight? More static. The empty silence on the radio made me feel even more alone. I took another sip of coffee, forcing myself to focus on the road. Just a few more hours, and I'd find a rest stop. Just a few more hours, and this night would be over. I was starting to calm down when I saw another one. Another man in the ditch, lying in the same position. Face down, arms stretched out, body motionless. A cold chill ran down my spine. I knew it wasn't the same man. I had driven miles since I saw the first one, but everything about him was identical. I tightened my grip on the wheel. This time, I didn't slow down. I passed him quickly, forcing myself to look straight ahead. But in my side mirror, I saw the same unnatural movement. The man's head lifted. His body jerked, twisting slightly toward my truck. I cursed under my breath, my pulse hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I pushed down on the accelerator, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was happening on this road. 15 minutes later, I saw another one. This time, I nearly swerved off the road. Not because he was lying in the ditch, but because he was closer. Much closer. This one was barely 3 feet from the pavement, his face turned slightly toward the road. I couldn't see his features, just the dark outline of his body against the grass. I didn't slow down. I didn't check my mirrors. I just kept driving. I turned the CB radio back on, my hands shaking as I grabbed the mic. Breaker 19, someone talk to me, I said, my voice unsteady. Anybody else out here? For a moment, nothing. Then a crackle. A voice. You seeing them too? The voice was low, tired, but there was something in it. Something that told me I wasn't alone in this. Yeah, I breathed. How many have you seen? A pause. 5, the voice said. Same spot. Same position. Same movement. I swallowed hard. What the hell is this? Don't know, the driver admitted. But I've been driving these roads for 15 years, and I ain't never seen anything like it. Neither had I. We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us listening to the hum of our engines, both of us trying to make sense of what was happening. Then he spoke again. You think we should stop? I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. No, I said. Keep driving. Don't stop. I stayed on the CB with him, neither of us willing to disconnect. We rode in silence for another hour, waiting, listening. But no more figures appeared. I started to think it was over. Then, just as I reached an old highway junction, I saw the last one. He wasn't lying in the ditch. He was standing in the middle of the road. My breath caught in my throat. His posture was the same as the others, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly downward. But this time, he was facing me. My headlights washed over him, but I still couldn't make out his face. My hands were ice cold on the wheel. I had 2 choices, swerve or drive straight through. I made my choice. I gritted my teeth, my heart slamming against my ribs, and I floored it. The truck roared forward. The man didn't move. And then, just before I reached him, he vanished. Not like a person diving out of the way. Not like something rolling off to the side. He simply disappeared. I drove for another 3 hours before stopping at a truck stop outside Little Rock. I got out, stretched my legs, and let the cool night air wash over me. My head was pounding. My hands were still trembling. I don't know what I saw that night. And to be honest, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never drive that highway at night again. I've been a trucker for over 12 years, and I've seen plenty of strange things on the road. But nothing ever shook me like the night I found someone in my sleeper cab. It happened about 5 years ago, somewhere in Oklahoma. I had been driving all day, hauling a load of produce from Texas to Missouri. It was late, almost midnight, when I finally decided to stop for the night. The rest area was small and nearly empty. A few trucks were parked in the lot, their engines humming softly. The place was dimly lit, with only a couple of flickering streetlights casting weak pools of yellow light onto the pavement. I pulled into a spot at the far end of the lot, away from the other trucks. I liked parking alone when I could. It meant fewer chances of someone bothering me. I locked my doors, checked my mirrors, and climbed into the sleeper. I was exhausted. My body ached from the long drive, and all I wanted was a few hours of good sleep before hitting the road again. I had no idea I wasn't alone. As soon as I lay down, I felt off. It was hard to explain. The sleeper cab was quiet, the only sound my own breathing. But something didn't feel right. It was like the air in the truck was heavier than usual. I turned over, trying to get comfortable, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. My skin prickled, like someone was watching me. I told myself I was just tired. I had been on the road too long, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound. I froze. It came from inside the truck. My heart started pounding. The sound wasn't loud, just a soft shifting noise, like fabric moving against fabric. But I knew one thing for sure. I was alone. At least, I was supposed to be. I held my breath, listening. My eyes darted around the dim space. The sleeper cab wasn't big, just a small bed, some storage compartments, and a curtain separating it from the driver's seat. There weren't many places to hide. But the sound came again. A slow, deliberate movement. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands. I turned it on, and I saw him. A man was lying in the far corner of the sleeper, curled up in a ball, half covered by a pile of blankets. He wasn't supposed to be there. My stomach dropped. My breath caught in my throat. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. How the hell had he gotten in? I locked my doors. I was sure of it. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the wall. My flashlight beam shook as I pointed it at him. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted. No response. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch. For a moment, I thought he might be dead. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. My fingers clenched around the flashlight. I had to know if he was alive. Slowly, carefully, I moved closer. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse. "Are you okay?" "Nothing." I took another step. Then he moved. Not like someone waking up. Not like someone stretching or shifting in their sleep. It was sudden, sharp. His head snapped up, and I finally saw his face. And my blood turned ice cold. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were wide open, too wide, bloodshot, unblinking. And he was smiling. Not a normal smile. Not something a person should make in the middle of the night. His lips stretched too far, like his face couldn't quite contain it. His teeth were yellowed, crooked, and he was staring right at me. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, to throw myself out of the truck and never look back. But my body refused to listen. Then he laughed. A low, wheezing chuckle that sent a wave of pure terror down my spine. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was slow, hollow, like he was laughing just for himself. I felt my stomach twist. My hands were shaking, so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. And then he started to sit up. That was it. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I lunged for the door, yanking it open with shaking hands. Cold night air rushed in as I practically threw myself out of the truck, landing hard on the pavement. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, my heart slamming against my ribs. I expected to hear footsteps behind me, expected to see him crawling out of the cab. But nothing happened. The truck was silent. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood there, chest heaving, my legs weak. My brain tried to make sense of what just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I dreaming? No. I knew what I saw, and I sure as hell knew I hadn't imagined that laughter. I forced myself to move. I had to check. Had to be sure. Slowly, I stepped forward, my hands clenched into fists. I reached the door and peered inside. Empty. The blankets were still piled in the corner, but the man was gone. There was no way. I had been watching the truck the whole time. There was no way he could have slipped past me. And yet, he was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I locked my doors, double-checked them, and sat in the driver's seat with my knife in my lap. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I didn't dare close my eyes. As soon as the sun was up, I pulled out of that rest stop and never looked back. To this day, I have no idea how that man got into my truck. I don't know where he went, and I don't know what the hell was wrong with him. All I know is that I never park at that rest stop again.